Well, hello, class. Thank you for joining in with me on this first lecture. This is focusing on our sound system overview. And as I've shared with you before, this is going to be short and quick lectures. The goal is, of course, to get through the material. Much of this, you're going to have to spend a lot of time on your own, learning more and more hands-on. And we will spend some time in the workshops, especially working on these things. But this is definitely a broad class with many topics and discussion, but you're going to be able to use this information as a tool and a resource to dig deeper into your studies. But starting off, I just want to mention the concept of grounding. Grounding is a very important consideration with any setup, both permanent setups and then also temporary setups like a sound system you set up for like a revival service or when you're on the go or on the road. But really what it is it's an issue between your power system and your audio system, your sound reinforcement setup, and sometimes your lighting as well. Your lighting can tie into some grounding issues, and you hear a lot of interference and static, and a lot of times with grounding, it has a nice hum sound to it. But just as a mention, so you can make a connection if you've never learned this before, but like a standard extension power cable or plug, it's got 3 prongs. That circular plug, the third prong, is for grounding. It's designed to help you stay safe. I've even seen people cut those off as a hack because they need to use a different kind of plug, or the wall plug is different in an older building and things like that. You can take that risk, but it's designed to help protect your equipment and protect you. But properly grounding a piece of equipment gives potentially damaging electrical problems as you go forward. So it's less of an issue with newer buildings if they're built correctly. But grounding can definitely be a challenge. And with the grounding hum, aside from causing physical pain, grounding problems can induce an irritating hum in your audio signal. If you've ever had this kind of noise show up mysteriously at worst times in your sound system, you know the frustration is real. It's a difficult thing to deal with. And to keep moving on, we're going to look at different types of connections for your audio system, your sound system. RCA is the standard red, white, and yellow plugs. I remember growing up seeing that. It kind of replaced what we know as the coax cable of the television setup, where it was all one plug, and it has that screw type that holds it in. Well, then quickly we moved on to DVD players and things like that in the 90s, and you started seeing more of the red, yellow, and white. So many of y'all have seen that before. The red and white is the audio, the yellow is the video. So in this case, we're talking about RCA connections, and when it regards to our sound system, the RCA connectors, our phono connectors, are mostly typically used in home stereo configurations. They're small, inexpensive, and not usually used in a professional application. That's not necessarily the case, but you don't see them as often these days. You have to use a lot of different kind of converters. I will say, we'll talk about stereo and mono audio. It's one of the faster ways or more direct ways to split your audio for things like multi-tracks and clicks. But they are definitely inexpensive. I will say these days they're more difficult to find, and those connectors and things of that nature are also difficult to find. But it is a good connector to know about, and in some cases you may have to use them. And moving on, we're looking at what you call dual banana connectors. This is definitely a rare connection. I have seen it. I've dealt with it before. The time that I saw it was in connection to the power amps running to the speakers. And of course, I can show you a picture here, what that looks like. You're very rarely going to see this, but it's similar to the RCA in the sense of it's a stereo setup running to the speaker systems. But yeah, it's a rare thing, but most of the time it's connected to the amplifiers that are running to the speaker system. Another connection that is way more common nowadays is called a speak-on connector. This is a connector with a blue, and this is what really distinguishes it, a blue tip to it with a gray and black connection point, and it actually twists when you plug it in. It actually twists to the right. I've seen another variation of the speak-on connector. It was like a universal, which we'll talk about, 1/4 inch in just a minute, but it had a 1/4 inch and speak-on, so it was kind of had a variety of uses. But that's I've never seen that since then. It was a really interesting or creative design. But speak-on is becoming more and more of a standard for speakers, and they're quick, convenient. They're also, if you ever get into splicing cables and cutting them, from my understanding, I've never done this myself personally, but friends of mine who have done it, they said speak-on is one of the easiest kind to learn how to splice cables and customize the length for your specific application and ministry and setup. Moving on, we're looking at what is called an XLR cable. XLR cables are most commonly known as microphone cables. Of course, that's not the only use that they serve as, but that is their most common connection in people's minds. Occasionally, these can be used as speaker cables, even based on the speaker type. I personally own a powered speaker system, which we'll talk about more of that in just a minute. Powered systems, but I'm able to run directly out of the soundboard via XLR into the speaker system. So it's similar in the sense of like a speak-on cable where it locks in and it doesn't come unplugged very easily. XLR is the same way. It pops in and stays in that position really securely. But like I said, most of the time it's used for microphones, also for other types of connections and input systems directly into the board. They also are used for lighting systems as well, with DMX stuff that we'll talk about in other lectures. There's 3 parts to it. There's 3 pins on the inside of the enclosure, and there's a male and female side, and it's pretty simple to understand. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these cables, but the technical term is called an XLR cable. The next and probably most common cable that you'll see in your sound system is called a 1/4 inch or 1/4 cable, which includes instrumental and speaker cables. And these 2 cables, the difference between the 2 is very subtle, but there's at least in the design and the visibility of it when you're looking at it, but the application is not so subtle. If you try to use a speaker cable to plug your guitar or your keyboard or some kind of input instrument, you'll notice a massive amount of static that's hard to ignore. And it's because there is a slight different design. There's bands that wrap around the tip of this cable, and with the instrumental cable there are 2 bands. With the speaker cable there's only 1, and of course that makes a difference in its audio setup. But in its essence, 1/4 inch is the term for what we know as instrumental cable or speaker cable, and it's important to know the difference and also be able to quickly use. I will say speaker cables normally are less expensive, and you can buy a longer cable because the application, of course, is to connect to your speakers. Instrumental cables tend to be a lot more expensive. They're because they're different, and you can get away with using an instrument cable for a speaker option if you're in a pinch, but I would definitely not do that long term just because of the cost, and that instrumental cable can be used elsewhere, and we'll talk more about that. I want to move on to what is easily understood as an 1/8" cable, which is known as a headphone jack, as I referred to for years, and now is referred to in many cases an aux cable. It's seen in many modern cars now. This type of cable is commonly used for sending audio signals from a computer or media device, a tablet or a phone. This is extremely important when you're talking about multi-tracks and click systems, both if you're running them from the stage or from the booth. Either way, 9 times out of 10 it's coming out of an 1/8" plug or cable, and that's you can guess it's about half the size of a 1/4" cable. And so, sometimes people say aux cable or headphone jack, but the 1/8" is the technical term for it. Moving on, with these types of cables, there are some converters, and one of those especially, I'll mention just as a side note, there are hum eliminator boxes that can help with speaker systems or sound systems that have a ground hum that's sometimes impossible to remove unless you rebuild the entire facility. But they can help lessen some of that hum. Well, what's nice is if you buy a direct box that we're talking about here, a direct box a lot of times has what they call a ground lift on it, which can help with a specific instrument or specific input into the system. And I've seen people even try to rerun their sound system through some of these just for the ground lift. But at that point, I would just buy a hum eliminator box. But direct boxes are primarily used for 1/4" instrument cable to be converted over to XLR. XLR is 9 times out of 10 going to be the main input on your Snake, which is on the stage, which plugs directly into the sound system. And so since you don't have a microphone cable coming out of your guitar or your keyboard into the floor, or into your Snake system running to the back of the room, you need a direct box to switch over. But it's also, they've got passive and active ones, which basically means they're powered with a battery or powered 48V, which we'll talk more about later, like condenser microphones. But that basically allows you to have a little bit more presence in your sound, but then also that ground lift is a major benefit. Next, I want to discuss mono audio and stereo audio. Mono audio is a single audio that has equal balanced audio on both sides of the recording or mix. So if you're listening to headphones, it's just one of the easiest ways to understand this. Your audio in your left ear is identical to your audio in your right ear. With stereo, that may not necessarily be the case, and this was not something until I believe it was the 70s and 80s with instruments, and it might have even been back in the 60s a little bit. But I know some of the early, like especially British Revolution, early rock and roll bands that we hear, a lot of their music was mono because that was the only thing available. And if someone had access to stereo recording systems, it was just such a new thing, it didn't seem necessary. It's kind of like converting over from tapes to CDs. It didn't really seem that necessary at the time. And now we're saying, what's a CD? Technology improves over time, but some of the neat differences, of course, can be the fact that stereo audio allows you to mix things both in the studio recording and in a live mix, live room, front of house, more dynamically and balanced, to where, we'll talk about this later, but panning, you can pan your audio in different channels. So you don't have to have as much volume, but you can have a better mix, which brings more clarity. Moving on, we're going to continue to discuss more inputs, but one of the things we want to talk about is microphones. One of the most standard microphones that if you've ever used a vocal mic, it was probably a dynamic microphone. Dynamic microphone has a standard pickup pattern. We'll talk about pickup patterns in a minute, but where it's very directional, unidirectional, meaning it picks right up directly in front of you. If you hold the mic just a foot away from your voice or your instrument, it almost doesn't even pick it up at all. So it's very useful in the sense of it's perfect for vocals and some instruments, and it also is helpful to avoid feedback on the stage mix. Also, it does not require power. So unlike some other microphones, it is a passive input instrument, and you do not need 48V to boost that microphone to work. Like I said, these are perfect uses for handheld vocals and some instruments. Next, I want to talk about condenser microphones, which do require 48V or phantom power to run this kind of microphone. You'll see that on most sound mixers, there's a button on the channel that you can select to send power through the cable to the microphone. Some microphones, condenser microphones, have battery power inside of them that can run on their own without 48V. But either way, it needs power to run. But condenser microphones, and all the microphones have different pros and cons. The condenser microphone is one of the next level microphones, especially in the studio setting, especially for the recordings and a controlled environment, audio environment. But some people use them live on stage, and they're good for instruments. They're good for vocals. If you've ever watched a video of someone in a studio, you probably watched them recording on a condenser microphone. And there's a bunch of different types, but the main difference is there's more depth and richness to the sound, and then it also requires battery power or some extra voltage to run it. So discussing different types of pickup patterns and uses, I mentioned earlier that handheld microphones are commonly very directional microphone where it doesn't pick up other sounds on stage or in the room to avoid some feedback issues, because feedback simply is an instrument or a microphone, most commonly microphones, picking up in a circular motion of audio, basically feeding itself back to where it just continues to circulate through the sound. And directional microphones are great at picking up exactly what they mean to pick up. Picking up the one thing that's standing right in front of it, or being held right in front of the vocalist or right in front of the instrument. And they're simple. They're also less expensive, and they're very durable microphones. They tend to be less fragile than the condenser microphone setup. As I mentioned before, a good condenser microphone can go a long way. One of these would be a shotgun style microphone. And for different pickup patterns, this is a pickup pattern that is used, and we'll talk about this more, with shooting videos for your church. But this is a very extremely isolated pickup pattern and direction, to where you can have the microphone a good distance away from its source, especially a speaker or an instrument. It's like a shotgun. It has a very directional shot to it. You point it, has kind of a wand, kind of long tube shape to it. And if you've ever seen someone holding a boom mic over the head of someone in a studio setup, like a video shot, you see that microphone over their head. That's kind of a shotgun style microphone that picks up very directional. Sometimes you can have it set up in different ways to where it's discreet and not visible, but these are really, really good microphones for specific applications like that. Omnidirectional microphone patterns. Most common would be your pulpit microphone or lectern setup, where it picks up kind of in the vicinity of that location. It picks up in a very rounded thing, but it also, like choir microphones, which any of y'all have worked with those and try to mix and balance those, is a massive challenge. It's so hard to get a good volume and good pickup from your choir without feedback city, as I like to call it. Because those microphones pick up everything, they also connect quickly to any monitors and speakers that you have on stage that your choir and instrumentalist can hear. So these microphones can be a challenge, but they're perfect for an ensemble, perfect for a group, instrumentalist or vocalist, that need to pick up like a choir, kids choir, adult choir. I've used over the years portable microphones like this, kind of a hack between a pulpit microphone that wasn't being used anymore, and we were able to hook it up to a stand, and that was really nice because we could position it with like a children's choir up front. But a lot of times these microphones are hanging from the ceiling for choir lofts. But again, these are great microphones, but they're also a challenge quite a bit because of their pickup patterns. So if you're wondering where the feedback's coming from, check your omnidirectional microphones first, i.e. your choir mics. And that should help you throughout most of your weeks in your church. Quickly moving on, we're going to talk about speakers, the basics of a speaker cabinet. They're typically, sometimes there's 3, but typically there's 2 components within the cabinet of a speaker. Behind the sound grill, if you can kind of peek through, you'll see a woofer and a horn. The woofer is the round speaker portion, normally at the lower part of the speaker if it's sitting upright. And that's what provides more of the lower frequencies, some of the mids, but mostly low frequencies. So you hear the term subwoofer, but that lower woofer, even in a loudspeaker, it has a woofer on it. And then there's the sound horn, which is actually a lot smaller than you would think, at the top part of the speaker. And that's the portion that provides probably 90% of the sound that you hear. And so when you're positioning your speakers, know where the sound horn is and which way it's pointing, and strategically position your speakers in that way. That helps out a ton to understand and know. But then there's also the application, I'll just mention this on the side, there's subwoofers that are completely separate from loudspeakers. And those are incredibly useful and helpful to give a lot of presence to the lower end of the sound. But understand that your typical loudspeaker does have a woofer on it, and it does project that sound. But having a subwoofer separate gives more flexibility to enhance your mix. Moving on quickly, just want to mention the sound mixer. This is the board where the operator controls the front of house FOH, stage mix, and any other auxiliary sends that are necessary. The primary job of the faders that most people think about first, the little sliders, are to mix the front of house. So that is the primary job. Once you've set everything, we'll talk about this in the next lecture, but once you've set everything in the live setting, you simply need to run the faders and make sure everything is balanced in the live setting with those faders. The aux sends, which are used to send to, nowadays, Facebook Live. If you've got speakers in your lobby area, nursery, if you're sending to any other kind of broadcast setup, but also your stage audio. It's also for your in-ear monitors and things of that nature as well. I mentioned this before, but the Sound Snake system is a system that runs almost, I jokingly say, like Medusa, the Greek mythology, with the snake head, the snake hair. But that's what it looks like on the end of this cable as it connects. This is the analog version of a snake. There's now digital snakes, which simplify a lot of this. But I believe wholeheartedly, if you can understand the analog concept, you can quickly convert over to the digital concept of sound reinforcement. But this allows you to not have your soundboard on the stage to be able to connect all of your instruments and inputs and vocal mics into it. And so it's a braided system that runs a connection between the stage and the tech booth or setup. like I said, individual plugs for each channel. And the other end of the snake allows the performers to connect to that box, or if it's a permanent solution, it's a stage that has little boxes around the stage that you can plug different microphones and inputs into, XLRs or 1/4-inch cables, with a direct box, of course. And so that's what a snake does. If it's a permanent room, your sanctuary, you're not going to ever see what the snake looks like. Hopefully you won't have to do any maintenance on it, but understand how that works. And if you're doing a road gig or you're doing an event, you'll have to have a snake to be able to run things back and forth to the back of the room, especially if you've got slides, presentation software set up. You're going to want to connect everything into the same booth, the same area. And lastly, I want to conclude with the sound amplifiers. For every speaker, there has to be some kind of power running to it to be able to run sound. Just briefly, I'll just mention this: sound is pressure. Sound requires power to push that pressure. And so there are boards that have amps within them, which are convenient. There's also like portable PA systems that have their amps within the sound mixer. For a very basic system, basic setup, quick and easy to pack up and take somewhere. But then also, and the most common would be amplifiers, which either are in the same vicinity of the soundboard with like a rack mount, or they're on the side of the stage connected to the sound system on the stage for the speakers close by. But either way, those amplifiers are sent from the board to the amplifiers to the speakers, basically. And that's just to provide the volume. And on those amplifiers, there are volume knobs that for the overall balance. And you have to make sure you have enough power for the needs of your room. The other becoming more popular option is powered speakers. What's really nice about these speakers is they have their own power set up within each individual cabinet. And of course, you have to provide power cables to run to those. But on a portable setup, I've purchased this my own system a few years ago, and it's been so incredibly helpful because I'm able to balance out the volume quickly and set up quickly. And you can also push your system a little bit more with a powered speaker system. Now, of course, these speakers are more expensive, but if you consider the offset of not having to buy amplifiers, it may be worth the little extra money in that purchase. But either way, just remember you have to have amplifiers to power any of your sound. The same thing with instruments, keyboards, bass guitar, electric guitar, even some acoustic guitars have amplifiers. All of these require some sort of power or juice to finish off, to both create the sound and send the sound. And so in conclusion for this, I know this was a lot really quickly, and of course I've definitely not covered enough, but I do believe this is helpful to you. I do believe this is practical, and by all means reach out if you have any questions. One of my main goals is to help resource you and help connect you with some of these online platforms that I've learned a lot of things from myself personally. And this next lecture, we'll talk more about how to mix the sound, both live in the room, in studio, and stage, in-ear monitors, and all the different mixes. And thank y'all for listening in.